Mau Mau, the name normally used to describe the ragtag army of fighters for Kenya's independence in the 1950s, has gained notoriety of its own. The name evokes fear and dread and admiration in equal measure. Yet few names of movements, historical episodes, or even of individuals are characterized by so much mystery around their origin and meaning.
You will need a symbol, a sign, a name. Here it is. Mau Mau.
No one seems to have the definitive answer as to where the name Mau Mau came from or what it originally meant. Much has been written about the Mau Mau, but most of it tends to link the Mau Mau to tribal magic, fanaticism, terrorism, savagery, atavism, and unlawful actions. Because of such consistently unkind portrayal, Mau Mau has come to appear wholly as a negative force, and its importance has been largely misunderstood. Of course, there is no doubt about the source of African grievances that led to the War of Liberation that is famously known as Mau Mau War. The controversy is limited to the origin and meaning of the name Mau Mau only. In summary, as far the grievances were concerned, Africans, particularly the Kikuyu people who had a more prolonged and intimate interaction with colonial settlers than most other Kenyan communities, complained about the appropriation of their land by the colonizers. The imposition of hefty arbitrary taxes, racial discrimination, distortion of their religion, and its replacement with an alien one. Prohibition of cultural rights such as circumcision, lack of political representation, and denial of rights to farm certain cash crops such as tea or to keep pedigree cattle. Although the Africans had complained for a long time, it was the Second World War that became the straw that broke the camel's back. According to Professor Caroline Elkins, the war brought vast changes to Kenya. In particular, the war effort consolidated the settlers into a formidable economic, military, and political force, and forced Africans to join the war either as soldiers or as laborers in order to produce as much as possible for the war. These changes made worse and exposed the inequalities that existed between the white settlers and the Africans. The changes also galvanized discontent among the people of the central Kenya region. To win the war, the British recruited troops from all over the empire, including Kenya. Kenyans were sent off to fight for the British in such diverse places as the Middle East, Ethiopia, and Burma. After the Allied victory, the African soldiers returned to Kenya with a new global awareness, including anti-racial and liberation movements, political sophistication, and ideals of equality. They watched as white soldiers were given demobilization support. Such support included pensions, huge tracts of land, loans, and hefty handshakes. To make the matter worse, an additional wave of colonial settlers were invited into Kenya and given land through soldier settlement schemes. The new settlers introduced agricultural mechanization, which in turn had a negative impact on job opportunities.
At Government House in Nairobi, capital of Kenya, executive members of the council meet the Colonial Secretary, Mr. Oliver Littleton.
At the same time, the colonial authorities reneged on what they had agreed with the Kikuyu before the war. For instance, from 1946 to 1950, the Kikuyu demanded control of the Karatina dried vegetables factory, which had been set up for the production of food for the army. it had been agreed that a Kikuyu-owned company called the United Companies of Mumbi would own Karatina dried vegetables fully after the war. But the British changed their mind after the war, saying that Africans were incapable of running the factory. The colonial government clearly never appreciated that things had changed after the Second World War. The colonialists continued to believe that the answer to whatever grievances the Africans were expressing lay in better economic growth under colonial supervision and tighter police control. With such a gap existing between colonial authorities and Africans, it was clear that the angry native Kenyans on the one hand and the gluttonous, insensitive government and settlers on the other were clearly on a collision course. The upshot of all these was that there emerged angry groups of people with no property or jobs or prospects of any kind as African quarters in Nairobi became crowded with desperate, unemployed youths. One such group comprised of young men known as Anake a 40, or the Group of 40, the name given to the Kikuyu age set who had come of age in 1940. Many of them had gone into war, fought gallantry, and returned to nothing. With knowledge and skills in modern weapons, but without the weapons, the Group of 40 engaged in political extremism, as can be expected. They were joined by a new religious sect called the Dini ya Jesu Christo, members of which reverted to wearing skins and carrying bows and arrows which had already been banned by the African Arms Ordinance, a colonial law that had prohibited the Kikuyu from carrying arms since 1918. At the same time, the Kikuyu Central Association, which had been oathing people for purposes of unity since the 1920s, changed its name to Kenya African Union, hoping to become more national in outlook. However, it found its activities heavily monitored by the colonial authorities, forcing it to operate increasingly underground. Its political leaders became masters of doublespeak as they tried to hoodwink the authorities into believing that they were not involved in any conspiracies. For instance, in press conference in February 1951, Kenyatta was asked of Mau Mau.
Mau Mau? What is that? I have no idea what Mau Mau is. I don't even know what language it is, and I know quite a few African languages.
Kenyatta was dissociating himself from Mau Mau at a time when colonial intelligence reports were increasingly associating him with the movement. Under the leadership of more educated African leaders such as Jomo Kenyatta, Mbiu Koinange, the Kenya African Union continued to use Kikuyu traditional oath to unite the people against colonialism. This initial oath was a pretty mild compared to the oaths that would follow in the early 1950s. These secret activities dating back to 1946, after the return of Mbiu Koinange and Jomo Kenyatta, were known to the colonial authorities. As a matter of fact, Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, who had early in the century warned against the Kikuyu being allowed to brood over their grievances, sent a letter to the governor in 1948 in which he said that he had been warned by a Kikuyu chief that a new organization called Ma Ma would start murdering European settlers. This became the one of the earliest usage of the term Ma Ma, a hapless European's distortion of what later became known as Mau Mau. 2 years later, on August 4th, 1950, the Mau Mau movement was officially banned, although nobody knew for certain who was behind it. Its declaration as an illegal society had the effect of forcing it completely underground, determined to use the only logic that white man understood, force of arms. After the declaration of the state of emergency in 1952, the movement was forced to go into the forest from whence it waged its bitter war against the colonialists. Since then, the question of the meaning of Mau Mau has persisted. There are many theories relating to the meaning of Mau Mau. Some say that Mau Mau began at a place called Mau Summit in the Rift Valley, a place not too far from Olenguruon, itself the location of some of the earliest Mau Mau oath-taking. Others think the name was an imitation of a lion's roar, with which Dini ya Jesu Christo allegedly started its ceremonies and liturgies. Another theory states that Anake A40, the group of 40, who called themselves Gikuyu Maranga African Union, dropped the first word of its name, so that the initials of the remaining words formed the word Mau, which was then repeated for emphasis. Yet another theory says that the word Mau Mau came from the Kikuyu name for oath, which is Muma, which was later bangled by Europeans who couldn't pronounce it properly and turned it into Mau Mau. J.M. Kariuki, in his book Emau Mau Detainee, says that Mau Mau is an anagram or rearrangement of a Kikuyu term, Uma, meaning get out, which was meant to warn the Mau Mau oath administrators and takers when police were approaching. The same meaning is given by Oiwando Abaur in his book White Highlands No More, citing prominent Kikuyu loyalists who supported the British colonialists against Mau Mau. Another different meaning is that given by Don Barnett and Karari Njama in their book titled Mau Mau from Within. They say that Mau Mau is an acronym that was formed out of the Kiswahili sentence, Mzungu arudi Uingereza, Mwafrika apate uhuru, meaning, let the European return to England and African obtain his freedom. However, this appears like a belated, exaggerated overreach, which were quite common those days, to create meanings for acronyms and abbreviations. For instance, the abbreviation OHMS, meaning On Her Majesty's Service, that was the official plate for colonial government vehicles, was filled in Kiswahili as Onyango hana meno sita, meaning Onyango is missing 6 teeth. Yet there was another meaning to the term. Chief Nderi Wangombe of Nyeri, while addressing the famous meeting at Ruringu in July 1952, used the term Mau Mau in the sense of the greedy eaters or gluttons. The chief was a government official and was certainly not out to praise Mau Mau. In describing the Mau Mau as gluttons, he was deploying a negative household metaphor hacking back to the Great Hunger of the 1890s, during which bands of warriors raided their own villages and grabbed food and livestock, which they ate as if the world was coming to an end. They were said to have eaten in a Mau Mau style, meaning to gobble up or to swallow whole, often without chewing like a monster would. It was a term of disapproval, and it is clear why the chief Nderi was using it to give a dog a bad name and hang him. For his troubles, Chief Nderi was killed by Mau Mau 3 months later, despite the fact that by using Mau Mau in this sense, that is, in saying the Mau Mau were gluttonous, he was engaged in a delicate balance, for the metaphor also suggested that the gluttonous were not always to be blamed, since being called greedy is often dependent on who is talking. The Kikuyu have a proverb that says, "The well-fed calls the ravenous greedy." Perhaps Chief Nderi, as was typical of many African colonial chiefs of the time who were fighting on both sides, was blaming the authorities for not feeding the agitated lot who had constituted themselves into Mau Mau. However, clearly the Mau Mau did not appreciate ambiguities or fence-sitting of any kind. What is clear is that the Mau Mau fighters did not refer to themselves as Mau Mau, Instead, they said their name was the Kenya Land Freedom Army. This was the name that was used by top military leaders such as Dedan Kimathi and Karari Njama, the Mau Mau War Secretary. In response to the colonial government, which had asked why they were fighting, the Kenya Parliament, the Parliament of Mau Mau that had been formed in the forest in 1953, explained their aim in the following terms as captured by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga in his autobiography, Not Yet, Uhuru.
We are fighting for all lands stolen from us by the Crown through its orders in Council of 1915, according to which Africans have been evicted from the Kenya Highlands. The British government must grant Kenya full independence under African leadership and hand over all land previously alienated for distribution to the landless. We will fight until we achieve freedom or until the last our warriors has shed his last drop of blood.
Whatever the name's origin, Mau Mau was first heard by police in 1948 and first mentioned in a newspaper in 1950. When it first emerged, no one was quite sure what it was. Was it a new religious movement or an underground political party? Was it a street gang? It soon became clear that its objective was to drive the Europeans out of Kenya. In a very clever propaganda campaign, the British colonizers deliberately turned the name Mau Mau into a catch-all phrase for every act of violence in the Kenya colony. Every act of violence, including some of the violence committed by colonial agents, was pinned on Mau Mau, and every criminal who got arrested was labeled Mau Mau. Today, Mau Mau has entered the English language, and it has two legacy meanings in the dictionary.
Tumekuambia kitambo, tukakwambia wakati ya uchaguzi. You are dealing with watoto ya Mau Mau.
On the one hand, Mau Mau has come to be associated with political intimidation through hostile confrontation or threats of violence. This meaning was popularized by the American writer Tom Wolfe, who in 1970 published his famous book, Radical Chic and Mau Mauing, The Flag Catchers, in which presented the harassment of public servants by black militants and Samoans in California in the 1960s as Mau Mau-type intimidation. On the other hand, Mau Mau is still widely seen as the metaphor of secrecy, resolve, and gallantry, the best example of what a people should do when all reasonable options are no longer available.
Go,